Hey, welcome back. This is where we talk about business communication in a way that's actually useful, not just technically correct. I'm Alex Carter, and I've always been interested in business, not just in results, numbers, or titles, but in how people communicate, how decisions are made, and how a single sentence can completely change the direction of a conversation. And even my family name fits into this idea quite well. Carter originally comes from an old occupation related to carrying and delivering goods, and in business communication, that's exactly what you're doing. You're carrying ideas and delivering them clearly from your mind to someone else's. And the better you do that, the more effective you become. And interestingly, this lesson didn't start in an office or a meeting room. It started much earlier, in a very simple situation. When I was a kid, I once tried to sell snacks in my neighborhood. Nothing serious, just a small business idea. But I remember thinking that if I wanted people to buy something, I had to convince them. So I prepared what I thought was a strong explanation. I talked about how good the snacks were, why they were worth buying, how they were better than anything else. I basically turned a simple question into a full presentation. And I remember clearly the first person I spoke to listened for a few seconds and then asked just one question. How much? That was it. All the explanation, all the effort, and the only thing they actually needed was the key information. And that moment stayed with me because the lesson was simple. People don't need everything you want to say, they need what matters, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. Most people think their problem at work is not saying enough, but in reality, especially at an advanced level, the problem is often the opposite. You're saying too much and losing clarity in the process. In business, people don't listen for long. Not because they're rude, but because they're busy. So when you explain something, your goal is not to say everything you know. Your goal is to say what matters and stop. But that's not easy. When you're speaking in a second language, or even in your native language in a professional context, you often feel the need to explain more, to justify more, to make sure everything is clear. So you start with a strong idea, clear and relevant, and then you add more and more and more until the original idea becomes less visible. Instead of saying we should delay the launch by 1 week to fix the main issue, you might say something longer, more careful, more indirect. And while it feels safer, it's actually less effective because people are still waiting for the main point. And this happens not because you don't know what you want to say, but because you don't fully trust that a simple sentence is enough. But in business, simple is powerful. The more experienced people become, the simpler they speak, not because they know less, but because they understand what matters. Speaking too much is often a form of protection. You're trying to avoid being misunderstood, trying to avoid sounding too direct, trying to avoid making a mistake. So you add more words just in case. But more words don't always create more clarity. Sometimes they create confusion because your listener has to process everything you say, and the longer you speak, the harder it becomes to follow your main point. So instead of helping your message, you dilute it. This becomes very clear in meetings. You're asked a question, you start answering, and instead of giving a clear response, you give a full explanation, background, context, details. By the time you finish, people are not sure what your answer actually is, and sometimes someone will interrupt and say, "So what do you suggest?" Which is a polite way of saying, "I heard everything, but I'm not sure what your point is. So here's a simple principle. Say the answer first, then explain if needed." I recommend option B. It's faster and reduces cost. That's already enough. If more detail is needed, you can add it later. The same applies to emails. Long messages often feel more professional, but in reality, people don't read everything. They scan. They look for the key point. So if your message is hidden inside a long paragraph, it might be missed, which leads to more questions, more emails, more explanations. So instead of writing more, structure better. Start with the purpose, be clear, and then add details if necessary. That way your message is easy to understand and easy to act on. Now, this becomes even more important when you move into decision-making conversations. In business, people don't expect you to give all the information. They expect you to filter it, to take something complex and make it clear. If someone asks for an update, they don't need the full story first. They need the situation, the problem, and the next step. We're delayed by 3 days due to a technical issue. We're fixing it and expect to recover by Friday. Clear, structured, useful. That's what moves things forward. The same principle applies in negotiation. Saying less can be more powerful than saying more. When you explain too much, you weaken your position. You reveal uncertainty. But when you are clear and controlled, your message becomes stronger. We'd like to revisit the pricing based on recent changes. Short, direct, professional, and then you pause. Because negotiation is not about filling space, it's about creating space. And this connects to something important. Silence is not a problem. Silence is a tool. When you stop talking, the other person starts. And that's where you learn what matters to them. But if you keep speaking, you lose that opportunity. The same idea applies when presenting ideas. Many people think they need to impress others with complexity. But the most effective presentations are structured and simple. One idea, supported by a few clear points. This strategy works for 3 reasons: speed, cost, and scalability. Now your audience knows exactly what to focus on. You're not just speaking, you're guiding attention. At a higher level, especially when speaking to senior people, this becomes even more important. They don't want details first, they want the conclusion first, then the reasoning if needed. I recommend we move forward with option B. It reduces cost and speeds up delivery. Now everything is clear from the beginning. That's how strong business communication works. And all of this connects back to confidence. When you trust your message, you say less. When you don't, you explain more. You try to make your message stronger with more words. But clarity doesn't come from more words, it comes from stronger structure. And confidence is not about speaking more, it's about speaking with purpose and being comfortable stopping. Because stopping means you trust what you said is enough. So next time you're in a meeting, writing an email or presenting an idea, ask yourself one simple question. What is the main point? Say that first, then stop. If more is needed, you can always add it. But you don't need to start with everything. Because in business, clarity moves things forward, not volume. And if your brain is now thinking, I should simplify more, but what if I say too little? That's okay. That's just your mind trying to add more again. This time, keep it simple. Oh, let's go further, because once you start noticing this pattern, saying too much, over-explaining, trying to make everything perfect, you begin to see it everywhere. Not just in your own communication, but in meetings, in emails, in presentations, even in how people respond to simple questions. And here's something important. In business, communication is not neutral. It has consequences. Not dramatic ones, but subtle ones that build over time. If your communication is clear, people trust you faster. If your communication is slow or confusing, even if your ideas are good, people hesitate. They don't always say it directly, but they feel it. And this is where language becomes more than vocabulary. It becomes positioning. Because every time you speak, you're not just sharing information, you're showing how you think. Let's take a very common situation. Someone asks you for your opinion. Not a big decision, just a small one. Maybe about a process, a timeline, a choice between 2 options. If your answer sounds like this, well, I think that maybe we could possibly consider option A. Although option B also has some advantages, and it really depends on how we look at it. What happens? You sound uncertain, even if you're not. Now compare it to this. I recommend option A. It's more efficient, and it reduces risk. Option B is possible, but it's less stable. Same idea, completely different impact. The difference is not in knowledge, it's in structure and delivery. And this becomes even more important in international environments, where English is not the first language for many people. Because in those situations, clarity becomes the main advantage. Not perfect grammar, not advanced vocabulary, clarity. People don't expect you to sound like a textbook, they expect you to be understandable. And here's something that often surprises advanced learners. At a high level, using simpler language is not a step backward. It's a step forward. Because now you're choosing simplicity intentionally. You're not limited by language, you're controlling it, and that's where professional communication begins. Now let's talk about something slightly uncomfortable, but very real. Sometimes we speak too much because we want to prove something. We want to prove that we understand, that we're competent, that we deserve to be in that conversation. So we explain more, add more detail, expand our answer. But here's the paradox. The more you try to prove your competence with words, the less confident you can sound. Because confidence in business is not about showing everything you know, it's about showing that you understand what matters. And that's a completely different skill. Let's take another situation. You're presenting an update. Maybe to your team, maybe to your manager. An overcomplicated version sounds like a timeline of everything that happened. We started with this, then we moved to that, then we faced this issue, then we adjusted, and then we continued. It's not wrong, but it's not efficient. Now compare it to this. We're currently slightly behind schedule due to a technical issue, but we've identified the cause and expect to recover by Friday. That's what people need. Situation, problem, solution. Everything else is optional. And when you speak like that, people start trusting your updates more. Because they don't have to search for meaning. You're giving it to them directly. Now let's go even deeper. There's a hidden habit that creates over-communication. And that habit is this: answering the question you think you should answer instead of the question that was actually asked. This happens all the time. Someone asks a simple question, and instead of answering it directly, you expand it. You add context. You anticipate follow-up questions. And suddenly, your answer becomes something else. But here's a better approach. Answer the question first, exactly as it was asked. Then pause. If more is needed, it will come naturally. Because in business conversations, clarity is often a sequence, not a single message. You don't need to say everything at once. You can build the conversation step by step, and that reduces pressure. Now let's talk about something else: interruptions. In many cultures, interruptions are seen as negative. But in business environments, they often have a different meaning. If someone interrupts you, it doesn't always mean they disagree. Sometimes it means they already understand. Or they want to move faster, or they are looking for the conclusion. So if you notice that you are often interrupted, it might not be about your idea, it might be about how long it takes to get to your point. And that's useful feedback, not criticism. Now let's connect this to listening, because strong communication is not only about speaking clearly, it's about recognizing what others actually need. If someone asks for a summary, they don't want details. If someone asks for a decision, they don't want background. If someone asks for a quick update, they don't want a full report. And the more you align your response with the real need, the more effective you become. Now here's another shift that changes everything. Stop thinking of communication as speaking. Start thinking of it as making decisions visible, because that's what you're really doing. You're showing how you think, how you evaluate, how you choose, and the clearer that process is, the stronger your communication becomes. Now let's take a slightly more complex situation. Disagreement. This is where many people start over-explaining again, because they want to sound polite, careful, professional. So instead of saying, "I don't think this will work," they say something much longer, something indirect, something that avoids clear disagreement. But in business, respectful disagreement is necessary, and clarity helps. For example, "I see the logic, but I don't think this approach will work in the long term. It increases risk." That's clear, respectful, professional. No need for 10 sentences. And again, the strength is in simplicity. Now let's talk about another situation, when you don't know something. This is where over-communication becomes very common, because instead of saying, "I don't know," people try to explain around it. They give partial answers, they speculate, they add unnecessary information. But here's a stronger approach. "I don't have that information right now, but I'll check and get back to you." Clear, reliable, professional. Because in business, clarity builds trust more than guessing. And finally, let's talk about something that ties all of this together: energy. Communication is not only about words, it's about how those words feel. If your message is long, uncertain, and unclear, it creates friction. If your message is simple, direct, and structured, it creates movement. And business, at its core, is about movement. Decisions moving forward, projects progressing, ideas developing, so your communication should support that, not slow it down. And this doesn't mean you have to change everything overnight. You just need to start noticing. Notice when you add extra sentences. Notice when you delay your point. Notice when you explain more than necessary. And then slowly adjust. Say a little less, structure a little better, pause a little earlier. And over time, that becomes natural. Because strong business communication is not about speaking more. It's about thinking clearly and letting that clarity guide your words. So next time you're about to explain something, ask yourself one simple question. What is the one thing they need to know? Say that, and then stop. Because in business, the person who communicates clearly is not the one who says the most. It's the one who makes understanding easy, and that's what people remember. You know what's interesting though? Once you start paying attention to this, you realize it's not just about language, it's about habits, almost like small automatic behaviors that you don't notice until someone points them out, or until you hear yourself speaking and suddenly think, "Why am I still talking?" even though your point was already clear about 30 seconds ago. And I think this is where things get a bit more honest, because most of the time we don't speak too much because we have too much to say. We speak too much because we're slightly uncomfortable stopping. And that discomfort is very subtle. It's not fear in a dramatic sense. It's more like a quiet feeling that maybe the message isn't strong enough yet. Maybe it needs one more sentence, one more explanation, just in case. But that just in case is exactly where clarity starts to disappear. Because if you think about it, in a real business conversation, especially in meetings, people are not listening to every word equally. They're constantly trying to identify the main point, almost like they're filtering your speech in real time, deciding what matters and what doesn't. And the longer it takes for that main point to become clear, the more effort they have to spend just trying to understand you. And once communication requires effort, something changes. People don't always say it, but they start disengaging slightly, not completely, just enough to lose that sharp focus, and then even a good idea can land weaker than it should, simply because it arrived too slowly. I've seen this happen so many times, where someone clearly knows what they're talking about. You can hear it in the details, in the examples, in the logic, but somehow the message feels heavy, like it's carrying too much around it, and you're waiting for that moment where everything becomes simple again, where the idea finally comes into focus. And then occasionally someone else speaks, and they say almost the same thing but in 1 or 2 sentences, and suddenly everyone reacts. Not because the idea is better, because it's easier to understand. And that's a very important shift to notice, because it means your goal is not to make your message more impressive, it's to make it easier to receive. That's a completely different mindset. Instead of asking yourself, did I explain this well enough? You start asking, is this easy to understand? And those 2 questions lead to very different results. Now let's take a very normal situation, something simple like giving an update. You've been working on something, there were a few issues, some progress, some delays, nothing unusual, just a typical work process. And someone asks, what's the current status? Now, if you follow the natural instinct, you might start from the beginning, explaining how things developed, what happened first, what changed, what caused the delay, what you tried, what worked, what didn't. And all of that is real. All of that is valid. But none of that is actually the answer to the question. Because the question is about now. So the strongest version of that answer always starts in the present. We're slightly behind schedule, but we've identified the issue and we're fixing it. We should be back on track by Friday. That's the answer. Everything else is optional. And what's interesting is that once you say it like that, you can actually feel the difference in the room, even if it's a small conversation. Because people relax slightly when things are clear. They don't have to guess. They don't have to interpret. They don't have to hold multiple pieces of information in their head, trying to connect them. They just understand. And understanding is what allows them to respond. Now here's where it becomes a bit more personal, because at some point you realize that over-explaining is not really about communication, it's about control. You're trying to control how your message is received, how you are perceived, how safe the interaction feels. And the more you try to control it, the more you add. More context, more explanation, more detail. But communication doesn't work like that. You can't control the outcome by increasing the length. If anything, you make the outcome less predictable. Because now the other person has more to interpret, more to focus on, more chances to misunderstand something. So in a strange way, saying less actually gives you more control. Because you're guiding attention. You're deciding what stands out. You're shaping the direction of the conversation without forcing it. And that's where communication starts to feel lighter. Not easier in the sense of effortless, but more natural, less heavy, less like you're carrying every possible detail with you. And honestly, that's when it becomes enjoyable as well, because instead of constantly thinking, what else should I add? You start thinking, what can I remove? And that question changes everything. It simplifies your language, your structure, your timing. It even changes how you listen, because now you're not just waiting to speak, you're actually noticing how others communicate, where they are clear, where they are not, where they lose the point, where they keep it simple. And once you see that pattern, you can't really unsee it. You start recognizing over-communication immediately, not in a critical way, just as a pattern. And that awareness makes it much easier to adjust your own style. You don't need to become minimal. You don't need to reduce everything to short sentences. You just need to become intentional. Say what matters, let it land, then decide if more is needed. And most of the time, you'll realize that it isn't, because the point was already there. You just needed to trust it. And that's probably the most difficult part. Not the language, not the vocabulary, just the trust. Trust that what you said is enough. And that's something you build over time, not by forcing it, but by noticing what works. You say something clearly, you stop, and you see the reaction. And when you see that people understand you without extra explanation, something shifts. You stop trying to add more automatically. You start allowing your message to stand on its own. And that's where real confidence appears. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and stable. So next time you're in a conversation, especially at work, and you feel that moment where you want to add one more sentence, just pause for a second. Not to stop yourself completely, just to check. Is the point already clear? And if the answer is yes, then maybe that's where you stop, because sometimes the most professional thing you can do is simply not add anything else. And I think this is a good place to slow things down and bring it all together, because at the end of the day, this isn't really about speaking less just for the sake of it, and it's definitely not about becoming cold or overly direct. It's about finding that balance where your ideas are clear, your message is easy to follow, and the person listening doesn't have to work hard to understand you, because that's what good business communication really is. It's not about showing everything you know, it's about making things easier for other people. It's about reducing effort, reducing confusion, and helping conversations move forward in a natural way. And when you start thinking like that, something shifts. You stop trying to sound perfect, and you start focusing on being clear. You stop trying to say everything, and you start saying what matters. And the interesting part is that once you do that consistently, people begin to notice, even if they never say it directly. Conversations with you feel smoother. Meetings feel more efficient. Decisions feel easier. And over time, that becomes part of how people see you. Not just someone who speaks well, but someone who makes things make sense. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be simple. Before you speak, before you write, just ask yourself, what is the one thing they need to understand right now? Start there, say it clearly, and then allow yourself to stop. Not because you have nothing else to say, but because you've already said what matters. And if it still feels a bit uncomfortable sometimes, that's completely fine. It just means you're changing a habit, and that always takes a bit of time. You don't need to get it perfect. Just notice it, adjust slightly, and keep going. That's enough. All right, I'll leave you with that. And if you've been listening this far, I really appreciate it. I know you're not just here to hear English, you're here to actually improve it, to understand how it works in real situations, and to feel more confident using it in your own way. So if this episode helped you even a little bit, if something clicked, or maybe if you just realized you've been over-explaining emails for the last 3 years, then you're definitely in the right place. You can subscribe and stay with me here. No pressure, of course, but if you do, we'll keep working on this together. Real business English, real communication, no unnecessary complexity. And next time you're about to write a long message or explain something in a meeting, just remember, you can always say less. I'll see you in the next one.